Welcome to look at that. And also, I put out here an 1870 lithograph of Hebron, which shows the location of the Correll home at that time. And then this is the bigger house that was built later. I think Erasmus and Lucy are going to talk about things I don't want to take away from them, but I do want to show you this, this is a letter I just got, and in it had this thing. These people sent us this artifact. This is not a person who is in favor of women's suffrage or an organization. Nebraska State Association opposed to women's suffrage. And the letter states this was written to Thomas Laners, our representative from this area who lived between here and Bruning. And this organization wrote to him to not vote for women's suffrage when that came before the legislature. This will probably be framed and put in the part of the women's suffrage display we have under people who oppose the amendment. But you're welcome to look at it. And now it gives me great pleasure to finally get to introduce to you Dave and Lee Cording, who are going to talk about this man that I've grown to love because he was quite a guy and a very well educated man. And so Dave and his wife Lee have consented to portray Erasmus and Lucy and tell us all about them. And we need to treasure these people who came here in the very beginning and fought for all kinds of things for our area. But this woman's suffrage was a big deal at that time. So, Lee and Dave, Lee and Dave, we're now ready for you as Erasmus and Lucy come to join us.
Thank you, Mrs. Williamson. You know, when you come back after 175 years from your birth date and 126 years from the date that you died, you find out that an awful lot of things have changed. I had a little opportunity to go through Hebron, and I think I only recognized 5 buildings. One of them was the bank building, which is now, I think, what we would have called a saloon. I think you call it a bar. Oh, yeah. The Presbyterian church I knew. The house next to the Presbyterian church I knew. There were a couple of other buildings along Lincoln Avenue, but there's just not much in Hebron. It's the same in 1895. I was born in Canada by an accident of birth. My parents were from New York State and they were vacationing there at the time. I suppose that means that I would have had dual citizenship the way we regard things today. But because they were residents of the United States, of the state of New York, I considered New York my home base. My parents traveled a lot, and that may explain something about the rest of my life. My parents went first to Illinois from New York, then they went to California in 1852. They went back to Rockford, Illinois in 1853, just a year later. They went back to California in 1860. While they were there, and bearing in mind that I was 14 years old at the time, I attended the University of the Pacific at Santa Clara, California. In 1865, they moved back to Rockford, and there I attended Eureka College in Eureka, Illinois, studying civil engineering and surveying. Eureka College was and is affiliated with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I married Lucy Wilder in October of 1868 and came to Meridian in Jefferson County. And I was out here as a surveyor. Now, at that time, Jefferson County was what we think of as Jefferson County and what we think of as Thayer County. And when you put those two together and you realize you're talking about a county that's 24 miles wide and 48 miles long, it's just barely smaller than the state of Rhode Island, for heaven's sake. So I was a surveyor out there. I surveyed a couple of different versions of an original town site for Hebron, and I hope the people of Hebron will forgive me for the error that I apparently made that makes all of our streets jog over at 7th Street as you go west. When we came out here, Company A of the militia was being organized over at Beatrice, and there was need for a militia against Indian raids farther to the west, and so the company had a division that was assigned to Fort Butler, and in connection with that division, I was a commander at the division here at Hebron. When Lucy and I came out here, we homesteaded at a site west of where Hebron is located now in 1869, and I surveyed a couple of potential Hebron town sites in 1869 and 70. One of those was done specifically for the Union Colony Disciples of Christ, who established Hebron as a location on August 8, 1869. A couple of years later, my parents came out here. My father, Landis, and his wife homesteaded in section 14 of 3-2 northwest of Hebron. And they stayed in Nebraska. My father died after I did, but he's buried out in Arnold, Nebraska. I built the first building that was located within what's now Hebron. And bearing in mind that we're talking about nobody living here, when I started the Hebron Journal-Register in February of 1871, there were 3 buildings in Hebron. Mine was one of them. There were 2 others. One of those was being used as a post office and a school, and Lucy's going to talk a little bit more about that because we both ended up teaching in the school. By 1873-74 school year, 3 years later, Hebron built a high school building. 1870 and 71 were really significant years in my life. I was named registered voters for Thayer County by Governor Butler in 1870, and I was recommissioned in 1871. So in 1871, I was the Register of Voters for Thayer County. I was the Justice of Peace. I started the Hebron Journal. There were 3 buildings in town. I was reading law and teaching. I was admitted to the bar in 1873. But the significant thing for me in that year was on September 26th of that year, Nebraska voters voted down the first women's suffrage proposal. Now, we're talking about 6 years after the end of the Civil War, and some of you may recall or be aware, if you aren't as old as I am, that in the years following the Civil War there were various amendments passed, one of which was the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment granted the ability to vote to everyone who had formerly been a slave, provided they were male. There were no provisions made for women. Wyoming, as a territory, had already been experimenting with the idea of votes for women, and they did in fact have votes for women as a territory. I started writing in the journal various columns because the prerogative of an editorial is that you can have opinions and you can give your opinions because you're publishing the newspaper. You get to get away with that. And my thoughts went along these lines. President Jefferson, before he was president, in fact, before there was a United States, talked about the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. President Lincoln, just a few years earlier at a battlefield site in Pennsylvania, had talked about whether a government that was formed along those lines could endure for any length of time. And he ended that proposal by saying, or that speech by saying, that we're met on having gone through a battle over that idea. So can a government that's of the people, by the people, for the people, endure? Well, who were the people? They weren't just the men. Half of the population wasn't able to vote. And so as we went through that period, I kept thinking about that, and I started writing about that, and my philosophy really, I think, is summed up in an article that I wrote that said women's suffrage ought to receive the earnest support of every citizen first, because by the birthright of existence, women as well as men are endowed with the natural rights of life, liberty, and happiness, and the protection of these rights is the first duty of government. My second point was because the Constitution of the United States declares that women are citizens, and all citizens are justly entitled to equal political rights. My third point was because women are governed, and the consent of the governed is the source of power in a just government. And fourth, because women are taxed, and taxation without the privilege of representation is tyrannical. We fought a revolutionary war over that one. I had other points as well, but those are the primary points that I was concerned with at the time that I was writing. Through the 1870s, on October 30th, 1877, Susan B. Anthony came to Hebron at the invitation of myself, my wife, the Green family, various other families that were in Hebron that were involved, that were thinking along the same lines that I was. On April 15th, 1879, Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to Hebron. In the wake of her visit, the Thayer County Women's Suffrage Association, the first one in Nebraska, was formed, and at my newspaper, the Hebron Journal, I instituted a column that Lucy was writing, but that was open to any female contributor, dealing with women's issues, but dealing with the issue of suffrage. Now, we're talking about 1880 in Hebron. In 1880, Hebron's population was 466 people. By 1890, Hebron's population was 1,511, but in 1880, Lincoln's population was only 13,003. So distances were remote, time was remote. We had a railroad running along the Platte, but we were just starting to get railroads other places, so transportation was difficult. I think about my parents moving to California and wonder how on earth they got there. Did they go overland? Because there wasn't any railroad to get them there. They could have gone around South America. But those were difficult times. We take our transportation, even in my day, with the railroad as a privilege. We don't think about how difficult that was. By December of 1881, there were 39 local women's suffrage associations in Nebraska and a state organization. I was elected to the Nebraska House of Representatives in November 1880 and served the 1881-1883 term. In October of 1881, the American Women's Suffrage Association in Louisville, Kentucky, elected me president of the organization. That says something about our times, I think, that a man had to be elected the president of the Women's Suffrage Association, but that's the way it was. Also in that time period, I was president of the Nebraska Editorial Association from 1881 to 1882, and I started publishing the Western Woman's Journal in 1882, which achieved a national reputation while it was being published. I'm sorry to say that I was really discouraged by Nebraska voters turning down women's suffrage in the 1883 election. The opponents included the liquor interests in Nebraska, because the people that were furnishing the beer and the whiskey and the everything else saw that there was a correlation to some extent between the suffrage movement and the temperance movement, but more importantly, they went to the immigrant population, which was German and Irish, largely in Nebraska, and said, if women can vote, you're going to lose your beer for the afternoon, and you're going to lose your whiskey, and this is going to be an issue. And if we think about that in terms of today, we had immigrants who were qualified to vote because they were men and because of the 15th Amendment, but they'd come from places where the governmental system wasn't anything like what we enjoy here. The Germans, of course, came from an absolute monarchy. The Irish were coming from a place where Queen Victoria was still regarded as the ruler. Ireland had not had its independence by that time. So it was a different environment, and it was creating potentially some problems for election. To finance what we were doing as a suffrage association, I took out a pretty significant mortgage, and I was pretty well in debt by the time that attempt failed. But I have to tell you, even looking back from today, from this distance, 126 years since I've been dead, I still have no patience whatsoever with the idea of voter suppression in any way, shape, or form. We work too hard. We work too hard and too long. First in the Civil War to get votes for the black population, the former slave population, and again in the 1880s up to into the 19 teens, early 20s, for votes for women. We work too hard for that. After that experience, I turned my attention to promoting development of Thayer County, especially the attempts to develop coal mines down toward Hubble, the expansion of the railroads across Thayer County, what was happening in agriculture in Thayer County. There was a plan to build a railroad that is of meaning to Hebron, Belvedere, Bruning, that was to go on, and did go on, as far as Chester, and it was intended to go to Salina. When the railroad was built, with some persuasion, I talked Lucy into taking a trip on the railroad, and I told her I think it would be a really good idea if we rode on the cowcatcher down here. She was incensed, just like she is today. The engineer, being a friend, said, "You can ride on the cowcatcher, and to preserve her dignity with the ladies of Chester, we'd stop a mile out of town and she could get into the carriage." I didn't. I stayed on the cowcatcher. One of the things that we did not have in Hebron or in the county was any kind of a jail. We built a jail in 1888, a real jail. We had a cage, but to have a real jail, we didn't do that till 1888. It wasn't that we didn't have any criminals. It's that we were dependent on sending them to Nelson if they had to be housed for any length of time. In 1888, Hebron built a new high school. The first building lasted from 1874 to 1888. That's not a very long time, so you can imagine what happened with our enrollment of high school age people during that time period. And when the high school downtown was abandoned, I bought it for the Journal office, and we moved the Journal into that building where it remained past my lifetime. The other thing that I bought during that time period was a steam press to operate, the steam engine to operate the presses. And I found out that if I had this steam engine and I had a boat, the steam engine was semi-portable at least, and you could move it to the boat and you could go by steam power up and down the Little Blue. We had a lot of fun doing that with a lot of guests. I stayed interested in state business despite the fact that I wasn't in the legislature anymore. And Governor Dawes made me Quartermaster General of the Nebraska National Guard in 1886 with the rank of Colonel. In 1890, I went to Ogden, Utah to manage and edit the Ogden Daily Commercial. From there, I was a delegate to the National Editorial Association by the Ogden Press in 1891. I was also a member of Utah Governor Thomas's reception committee for President Harrison in May of 1891. In July of 1891, I was commissioned by Nebraska Governor Thayer as Quartermaster of the Guard. So I returned to Hebron in August of that year, and I was elected to the Nebraska State Senate in the November 1892 election, and immediately on the Senate getting organized to do business, I was elected pro tem of the Senate. President pro tem of the Senate. That took place on January 18th of 1893. I was appointed to Governor Lorenzo Crowns' staff on May 11th, 1893, and I served as acting governor of Nebraska twice during his administration. That came about because both the governor and the lieutenant governor were out of the state for a few days. Somebody had to be governor, and it ended up being me. Governor Crowns had appointed me as the Cotton Sales and Industrial Exposition representative in Atlanta, which was to be held from September to December 1895. And sadly, I died on September 5th, 1895, so I wasn't able to do that for Governor Crowns. I was 49 years old. I crammed an awful lot into 49 years with travel, with things that I was interested in, with promotion of this county and my hometown over in Hebron. And I wouldn't have passed on any minute of it. I just wish I'd held in there a little bit longer. Lucy fortunately did. So Lucy can talk about the rest of the story.
I was born in Pennsylvania, July 22nd, 1850. So it's been 172 years since my birth. And as I look around your 21st century, I find things have improved for women, but not totally. Women are still not equal. We are still not paid the same as a man for the same job. There's still work to do. And it's up to you and people like you to do it. So don't drop the ball. My early life. Born in Pennsylvania, and the Civil War happened. That Civil War, plus the discovery of gold in California, created an enormous wave of immigration from the East Coast to the West Coast. And my family went with them. We moved first to Rockford, Illinois. I went to public school there, graduated, and unusually for women at that time, I also graduated from the Rockford's Female Seminary. Gotta get the right pronunciation of that. Which made me a college-educated woman. Not a lot of them at that particular time. And in Rockford, I met a man. A most unusual man. He was a man who admired the minds of women. He actually believed we had minds. And we had many conversations about women's position in the society that we lived in. And it was not good. Women were always subservient to the men. It was difficult for a woman to even have and handle her own money. She had to have a father or a brother or a husband to do that for her, because women didn't know how to handle money. Women couldn't possibly run businesses. Women were to be in the home, cook, take care of the children, clean the house, and that was it. ERASMUS and LUCY didn't believe that. He believed that a man and woman could have an equal partnership in life. And that's what really attracted me to him. He was also part of a group called the Union Colony. And this religious colony of the Disciples of Christ Church also valued women. Surprisingly enough, they were a very unusual group. They had many educated women among them. And women took an active part in their group dynamics. At any rate, we followed the Union Colony into Nebraska. Oh, we did get married in Iowa. So it was all hunky-dory there. Okay. And we located first in Meridian. Boo. Where we both taught school. That didn't last very long because the Union Colony was moving westward. They had already, or one of their members had already purchased a site in south central Nebraska, and the group had planned to create a settlement there. Unfortunately, this was the worst time for Indian raids in southeastern Nebraska, and so their plans had to be put off for actually a couple of years. But we homesteaded in Nebraska, near the site where present-day Hebron would be created. And we suffered through or endured the usual, the common lot of every homesteader probably anywhere in Nebraska or the Midwest. There was weather, all about weather. It wasn't any different then. There were locusts. Even then, destroyed crops, gardens, made life very difficult for one season. We thank the Lord they didn't come back. There were wild animals. There were the Indian raids. And as Mr. Correll was a part of the militia that had to go out and chase the Indians away, I remember too often cowering at home, hiding until he was able to return from the raid at that particular time. Thank God it was alive. The other danger I remember vividly were prairie fires. They were very horrifying. There was no way to stop them. We did not have a rural fire department at that time. And one prairie fire came very near to ending my life. I remember running as fast as I could, trying to outrun the flames toward a plowed area of the ground, and got there, threw myself on the ground, covered my head with a shawl so I wouldn't suffocate from the smoke, and was miraculously, I think, saved, and continued our life with Mr. Correll. About that time, the presence of the soldiers at Fort Butler and the militia managed to quell the Indian raids, and so the creation of the town site went on. As Mr. Correll mentioned, he did do the surveying for 2 town plots. He was counted as one of the 18 founding fathers of Hebron, and as such was given the ability to purchase 1/8 share in that community. Oh, I beg your pardon. There was 17 founding fathers and 1 founding mother. E.S. Potter was also part of that particular group and had her share of the township. And she built the 3rd building in Hebron. A small building became the post office and the first home of the Hebron Journal. And Ms. Potter was the 2nd postmaster. The first postmaster, Mr. Rhodes, because there wasn't a lot of mail coming into Hebron, his post office was a cigar box. Her building was slightly larger and gave a little more space to that. But she also had children, created a school so that the children of the town could begin to be educated. That was one of the major interests of the Union Colony and of me. One that I believe that in order to create a better society, we had to educate. We had to uplift, and we had to care for one another. And that was the goal I had all my life, especially women. My memory's a little weak, so I had to write some things down. When Mr. Correll started the Hebron Journal, we became business partners as well as marital partners. We worked together on the newspaper and helped to create many of the organizations around town. But at that time, we also became a family. In 1872, our daughter Lula was born, the first white child in Thayer County. 2 years later, in 74, Ernest came along. Oh, Mr. Correll was delighted to have a son. Yes, he loved his daughter too, men and sons. In 1876, Ivy was born, and like probably every other family, sorrow touched our family as well. Our daughter May lived only 4 months. We moved on, of course, as all families must. We were involved in many other activities in the Hebron. Even though the community was small, it seemed very tight-knit, and people were interested in creating a social life, a civilized social life, as well as a profitable family life. We were both involved in our church. Erasmus and I formed the first Hebron Literary Association. We met in our home, and it was for social interaction. It included things like readings, recitations, both dramatic and serious, and of course debates over important issues from the state level, the local level, even the national level. And yes, suffrage for women was a topic that came up time and time again, as well as other very important topics for debate, such as should Christians be allowed to dance? A very hot topic at the time. The end of the debate was resolved for that particular issue. Yes, it was okay for Christians to dance. That led to other organizations. Hebron had a band that was formed at that time, so there was music. We had traveling troops of players who would come to Hebron. Eventually there was an opera house in Hebron. But we had a good social life as well. But we didn't want to neglect the intellectual life. So Hebron formed a subscription library to begin with. And then later, about a year later, we formed the first Hebron Library Association. It didn't have a permanent home for quite some time, but it was an organization that was well used by the people in town. I'm proud to say I was the first president of that library association. Another interest of mine was in genealogy. Mind if I brag for a moment? My mother was Elmira Bunker Wilder. Yes, a daughter of the Boston Bunkers. It was their family ground, Bunker Hill, that provided one of the sites of the Revolutionary War battles. And it seems to me that that spirit of the earliest immigrants to this country and those who fought the Revolutionary War continued to flow through the blood of their descendants, because I found that there were other women who were eligible and interested, and we formed the Oregon Trail chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And it was an organization that existed for a very long time after that. I'll talk a little bit about some 20th century activities. But these were all women too who were interested in women's rights. Suffrage certainly, but also legal rights, educational rights, family rights. At that time, it was almost impossible for a woman, no matter how abused, to get a divorce from her husband, for instance. So we needed to pull together. And pulling together in those kinds of organizations, we also created the first women's suffrage organization in Nebraska. And I think Mr. Correll mentioned that by the time Nebraska was ready to vote again on women's suffrage, there were 39 organizations throughout the state. Suffrage was one thing that we believed would help solve many of the other problems that women faced. We had the right to vote. We could perhaps affect taxes and other kinds of women's rights, financial rights, legal rights. And so we formed that suffrage organization. And I met other women from other places, became friends with, for instance, Clara Colby from Beatrice, Aidan Bidenbender, who was, by the way, the first lady attorney in the state of Nebraska, Lucinda Russell from Johnson County, and Harriet Brooks from Omaha. And we were invited to Harriet's home in a few years, and with a few other women, and we created the beginnings of the Nebraska State Women's Association, Suffrage Association, and held 3 conventions, as I recall, one in Omaha, one in Kearney, later one in Lincoln, all to campaign for Nebraska granting women suffrage, women's right to vote. We were instrumental in bringing, my memory's failing again, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Mrs. Blackwell, for instance, to Nebraska. And these women had a major impact. At one point when Mrs. Stanton spoke to the legislature, one man had written afterwards that if the proposal had been put immediately after her speech, Nebraska would have been the first state in the Union to grant women's suffrage. Unfortunately, they gave men the right to think about it. And nothing happened. When Mr. Correll was in the legislature, he campaigned tirelessly for, again, addressing that issue, as well as other issues that were important to the state of Nebraska. When he established the Western Women's Journal, it became the major news organ of the suffrage movement in Nebraska, and then from thence to the rest of the country. And I wrote for that newspaper as well as the Hebron paper. He did, and he welcomed any other writer, male or female, who also wanted to write on women's issues. So it was a very popular but rather short-lived news organ. As Mr. Correll became more active politically, he was away from home more often, I had more and more responsibility for running the Hebron Journal. I was very fortunate because as our children grew up, especially Lula and Ernest, they too became interested in the newspaper and did much to help with the business and the publication of that particular newspaper. And as Mr. Correll mentioned, it was necessary because we were under a financial burden. We were never upper class, never wealthy people. Middle class perhaps, maybe even lower middle class in some cases. And work with the suffrage movement didn't pay a salary. Didn't pay anything, actually. And Mr. Correll worked not only in Nebraska, but over the whole country, trying to promote women's suffrage. When Nebraska failed to pass the 1980 proposal for women's suffrage, it was rather devastating. We worked so hard, so many people from all over the state had put their hearts and souls, as well as their money and their bodies, into the effort to get the word out and get that passed. And at that time, many of the leaders of the movement drew back. It looked like there was no chance it was ever going to pass. And as Mr. Correll noted, he had other opportunities, job opportunities, and things that he could also focus. So the children and I basically ran the Hebron Journal during those times. I was the business manager as well as a writer. I could count, and I could manage a business. And the Hebron Journal survived my handling. And then Mr. Correll died. My partner, one half of me. It was very difficult. The children were so helpful. They really buckled down and they worked. And as Ernest was so interested in the newspaper that he really took over a great deal of the work as he got older. And the Hebron Journal survived, as did we. I continued my work in Hebron, promoting education, helping women in whatever ways we could through our organizations, through our church, personally, and we kept going. Women do that. They may lose their partner, their love in their life, but they keep on going. And so did I. One happy memory I have was the celebration to celebrate the monument, to celebrate the Oregon Trail. The state of Nebraska, the Thayer County, Hebron, the DAR, Boy Scouts, everybody got involved in that celebration in 1915. A man named Ezra Meeker spearheaded the drive. He and his family had passed through on the Oregon Trail in 1855. And they still remembered that, and he felt it was important that the state, the county, everyone remember the hardships, the courage of those people who made that trip. And so they had a monument made. The Lowen brothers of Hebron created a $400 monument. That was a lot of money in 1914. I can't even imagine what it would be nowadays. But they planned, I was very honored. They asked me to plan the celebration, and it was a major thrill. We expected maybe 7,000 to 10,000 people to arrive. It rained. What's now Highway 81 was a dirt road. But still, for a small town, we had 2,000 visitors who came to help us celebrate that. And even the Burlington Railroad helped. they brought a train with 6 coaches that were filled to the brim, plus a few boxcars with riders on top. That train came to Hebron, where it would pull up close to the site of the monument, went back to Deschler and brought them a bunch more. And so we had a wonderful celebration. The DAR released doves of peace, 5 doves of peace, for obvious reasons and hopes and dreams. And surprisingly, one of those doves lit on the monument itself and stayed there all afternoon through all the speeches. Maybe his hearing wasn't too good. But it was a really thrilling experience for me, for the citizens of Hebron, for Thayer County, and I think for the state of Nebraska, to acknowledge these pioneers who had done so much for the state all the way through its territorial days to the present. Not much happened then. Involvement in community things kept me going, children kept me going. And then in 1918, finally, success, validation of all our hard work. The US Congress passed the 19th Amendment, allowing women the right to vote in national elections. It took Nebraska a little while. 1919, another year before Nebraska ratified that amendment. And in 1920, voter registrations were opened. And on September 18th of 1920, 98 people came to the courthouse to register to vote. 81 of them were women. I was one of them. The other 17 were men who were related to those women. And just a few weeks later, there were 31 more women who had registered to vote, which increased the Hebron voting registrations by 1/3. Ladies, let me congratulate you on your right to vote. It's a right, it's a privilege. Don't drop it. So much of what's going on in our country, even now, is in our hands, voters' hands, men and women. It's up to you. Use it.